We're Compound Everything, and we talk money, markets, and investing. And today we're going to kind of just wrap up our cognitive bias series, and we're going to talk about how to prevent or overcome these psychological problems that we may have in the market.
So we spoke a lot about psychological biases in the last video. And so it helps to know about psychological biases and what your biases might be. But then the question becomes, well, how do I combat that? If I know I'm prone to these things, is there tools and tricks and things like that I can use that would kind of keep me from shipwrecking myself? And I say that in a bit of a tongue-in-cheek way because there's one way to do that we're going to discuss today is something called the Ulysses contract. So Ulysses was a character in Homer's The Odyssey. And so he was voyaging home, I guess, from the Trojan War. He was piloting a ship. And I guess the legend is that he was told by a goddess or a prophet or something like that, a prophetess, before he was to set sail that he would be passing by this island. And in this island, there's sirens. And sirens were notorious for singing to sailors, and they would draw them in and cause them to shipwreck. So before he got to the island, he recognized this. He knew that he might be in peril and distress. So what he had his sailors do is put wax in their ears, and he ended up having himself tied to the mast. He told his sailors, tie me to the mast, and no matter how much I beg you, no matter how much I squirm and petition you to get out, if I do that, tie me tighter. And so they did that. The sirens sang, and he was actually able to hear their song. He pled desperately to get out, but they didn't do it, and he kept himself from shipwreck. So the idea then is, so how does this parallel to investing? And actually, you can use this in investing and decisions in general. So the idea is that you make decisions in advance before you get into a situation that you might find somewhat emotionally charged, or where you may be tempted to make an irrational decision. So in the market, the parallels are pretty obvious. So if a stock that you own has, maybe just skyrocketed and whatnot, the temptation is to hold on to it and, maybe it can gain a little bit more, right?
Right, you want to get a bigger return.
You got to get a bigger return. You get that fear of missing out on a bigger return, even though that this stock now may be wildly overvalued, because the market, we know, it will kind of fluctuate. It'll go up and it'll go down and whatnot. And as we spoke about last time, the Mr. Market analogy by Ben Graham is very parallel. Sometimes Mr. Market will offer you a wild price for your shares. And in that scenario, Ben Graham would say, well, you should sell. Mm-hmm. So the idea of a Ulysses contract in this regard is that you have preset decisions as to when to sell a stock. So I'm going to use an example.
And you do this when you're not in an emotionally charged.
Correct.
Right? So in the story, he was not in the situation.
He was in his right mind
at the moment.
He was in his right mind at the moment. So Ulysses was in his right mind. He had his sailors do time to the mast so that he could. The analogy and the parallel to the market is that you can observe the market, but you won't get burned by the market.
Right.
Hopefully, if you have good rules in place of when you should buy and when you should sell stocks and whatnot. So a very simple example of a Ulysses contract might be that you're watching a stock and the price seems to be dropping and it's getting toward your buy price, and you put a limit buy order in. Mm-hmm. And so you just leave it in.
You love doing that.
I love doing that. I've caught in many stocks. I actually caught Disney recently doing that one.
And you'll just leave it out for like months.
Oh yeah.
You'll just throw it out.
And it's kind of like my wish list. It's almost like I'm fishing. I throw my line out there and I just let the lure bob in the water.
I'm so opposite.
You are. Yeah, I know you don't
I'm like market buy, market sell, market sell.
I mean, it works for both of us, right? Like that's the thing. Yeah. So I caught Disney doing that. Mm-hmm. So I caught Disney in the 70s, and it managed to run up to well over 100. Yep. And so that principle for me works. So I put a limit buy, and I don't have to think about it.
Right. I think you bought Disney that way. And
I did.
You sold it on the.
Yeah, I've sold it with a limit buy, limit sell order. Yeah. So the idea there is, I don't have to watch the markets because I can't be watching it 24/7, or even during day jobs because I have a day job. Yeah. And so if it hits, great, it hits. If it doesn't, that's fine. And I've made the decision to buy at a certain price when I was rational. Mm-hmm. I'm not watching it ramp up and going, oh no, I'm going to miss it. So I leave that order in and I just sit it there. Mm-hmm. And then same thing to sell. I decide there's a specific time to sell, and at that point there's a specific price point. And I've made it based on my valuation of the company, and at that point I'm happy to let the shares go. Yeah. And so at that point it's the decision is made for me. I've done it while I was rational. I'm not getting fear of missing out. I'm not gearing, fear of loss and all that, loss aversion, fear of missing out. So 2 psychological biases that are kind of getting hopefully tossed out the window.
Yeah, you're
in
avoiding
doing that.
those.
I'm avoiding those. And then another way would be to use stop loss orders. I mean, that's maybe a little bit more for traders or whatnot, but a stop loss order or a decision to sell a stock.
Now, we don't use stop loss.
We don't use
because
stop
it's
losses.
not our type of investment.
Right. But if you're more of maybe a short-term trader or whatnot, stop losses may be a good way for you to avoid loss.
Yeah, short-term traders need them. And
Yeah.
I've talked to a few short-term traders who have really blown up their account because they didn't listen to their rules with the stop loss.
Yeah.
And they removed it in the heat of the moment, and they didn't follow their rules just to see their portfolio blow up.
Now, so those are pretty simple ways to avoid loss and avoid some of those other cognitive biases. I mean, one of the other things that we've learned from Manish Pabrai in listening to his counsel on YouTube and books and whatnot, and it was in his book, The Dondo Investor, I think that he mentioned, every investor should have an exit strategy even before they buy a stock.
Yes.
The idea was essentially that when you buy a stock, have an exit strategy either on the upside or on the downside. And so you have a preset time that you're going to get in or out. And if you don't have that, maybe you shouldn't be buying the stock.
So I think Michael Burry probably had some sort of valuation in mind, or as we can call it, a Ulysses contract for GameStop.
Yeah, so he obviously viewed it as undervalued at one point and bought the shares, as they were relatively cheap, and sold them actually fairly early on in the run-up because I guess he viewed them as being fully valued at that time. And he couldn't know that they would go on to, be like several X his money at that point in time. But he was obviously following rules. So the reason we mention that is to say that these Ulysses contracts are not meant to help you catch the top necessarily. They're to help you avoid making mistakes in the market that will burn you.
I mean, and here's the thing about GameStop. There were a lot of people who did buy in cheap, under $100, which was still crazy for the price. But I think it went up to like $480.
Yeah, it did, yeah.
How many people did buy cheap and watched it get to 200 and 300 and 400 and 480 and never sold because they didn't have an exit strategy just to ride it all the way down to whatever it is today. Yeah. Right? And here they were up multiples. Yeah. And they rode it all the way down. And if they had made some sort of decision in their mind or some sort of valuation or
stop loss, at 10% below the most recent high.
Yeah. And the other way it would have protected people, because I know a lot of people made money, but a lot of people lost money.
Absolutely. In
GameStop, and we always hear about right, the lottery winners.
That's right.
And the other thing that it would have helped them was a lot of people who end up bag holding wouldn't have even bought in the first place.
That's right.
But you got caught up in the hype. You got caught up. It's going up I think it went up 100% every day for a few days.
It was insane.
It's hard to stay away from that.
Yeah. And I mean, let's be honest. That was I'm going to say maybe a one in a lifetime opportunity in that regard. Whether it was an opportunity or not, well, it wasn't an opportunity for some people, and it was probably less than an opportunity for some others. But that was a once in a lifetime occurrence, let's call it. So you can't really base prediction rules on something like GameStop. But the idea there is that Michael Burry, he made money, he got out, didn't get burned.
Right, and I don't think he regretted it. Now that being said, people will say, well, he's wealthy, he didn't need to ride it up to 480 or 400 or whatever. But for all those people who lost money, they probably would have liked to just even had a 25% return.
Oh, absolutely.
Rather than
well, at some point, someone bought that stock at $480 a share.
Yeah, there was someone. Now, whether or not they got rid of it, there's no
I don't
know.
And what their loss was, I don't know, but it's still not back up to that point.
No.
So let's talk about a couple of other potential Ulysses contracts. So I mentioned, limit buys and stop losses and limit sells and whatnot. And those are fairly simple ones. Yeah. But you were mentioning the other day when we were talking about one, a couple that you like.
I guess these could be Ulysses contracts, but checklists. I love checklists. So I'm not huge
I like your checklist.
Yeah. So I'm a market buy, market sell. I have not I run valuations, and then when it gets there, I just do the market. That's just my personality. I also if I sell a stock and I'm just done with it, I do it right off my watch list.
I know you do.
So that's just my personality. But I love checklists. It keeps me from buying companies that I have no business owning, and it helps me to sell companies when I'm not prepared to sell, because for me, I get super attached to my companies.
I totally understand that.
So I put a lot of effort and work into finding them and reading about them and researching them, and then I love them. And then it's like really hard. It's like a breakup. It's like really hard to let them,
Well,
let them go.
you were giving me a quote by Nick Sleep. We're researching Nick Sleep for one of our future videos. And you had mentioned that he sold Amazon, and it was literally painful for him.
And I feel that. I feel that in my soul. So checklists for me, I have checklists like what's its debt to equity? Mm-hmm. Is it profitable? All these things. If it doesn't pass certain things, it just goes in the too hard pile. And it keeps me from just going into those companies because there's rules. And I've written my checklist and I've revamped it and I've changed it. But I do that when I'm in I'm not sitting thinking, should I buy this? I'm doing it just in a calm state of mind.
Right.
And then I have other things when I'm selling. Has the story changed? Have the financials changed? All of that. And I have these, or what's the valuation? Is it just way too overvalued? Like it's just too hot and I need to get out of it. I have all these checklists. And if it passes all those things, I can be like, sell. It's just time to sell. And then I don't have to regret it. And I don't need to look back because I followed the rules. And what I have found, because I also journal, which is also another way that you can keep tabs on your own emotions. I have found that when I don't follow the checklist, I almost always get burnt. There are outliers where I've done well, but almost every time I've either bought a position that I've lost on or I've sold too early. Yeah.
100%. So I think the idea of a checklist is wonderful. I mean, if you think about it, checklists are used in things like aviation. Mm-hmm. So pilots have checklists. Mm-hmm. Well, why? Because you are bound to forget something. Mm-hmm. Same thing in surgery suites. We use checklists all the time in medicine for the reason that if a patient comes in, so they're getting some sort of surgery, there's a checklist of this needs to be done, this needs to be done, this needs to be done. They even count the number of sponges and tools so that something's not left inside the patient when they're done operating. Why? Because those kind of things can burn you.
And I've heard for checklists, there shouldn't be more than a certain amount. They shouldn't be, because then you don't pay attention to them.
It gets too cumbersome.
And also, a lot of times the things on the checklist are just natural things that you should be doing, but those are the things that when we get into routine, sometimes we forget.
It may be also something that if you're researching a company and you really fall in love with the company, you may have the checklist kind of in the background of your mind, but you kind of go, well, I'm willing to bend the rules a little bit on this one. Well, the return on equity is not quite as high as I'd like it to be, but I'm willing to forgive that because I think the price momentum is going to continue. Right. And so you can't guarantee that necessarily. But if you make a hard and fast checklist of things that have worked for you before and things that you want to see in a desirable company, I think that's, again, keeping them from making a emotional mistake. And there's nothing saying that that company that's trading on momentum won't go higher, but there's nothing to say that it won't stop and go lower. So I think the use of a checklist is very, very reasonable.
And the other thing that I was talking to you about Ulysses contract was automatic investment plans.
Yeah.
And, we don't use those. That's not something I use, but I know that they have helped a lot of people. And more so for saving money, you have automatic withdrawals from your account. You get paid, it automatically goes in there. So that's just one way. You don't have to worry about it. It comes right out of your account. It's not something that you have to think about. I think for people who struggle with saving in general, and we always say, you can't invest if you don't know how to save.
That's right.
That might be a good way to just get your money into another account.
Yeah, so that might be a good idea, for instance, for someone who likes to index.
Moving on from Ulysses contract, these are other tools that we have found to be helpful. So accountability management, which just means you get an accountability partner or a group of people that you have similar styles of investing. I find that works best because it's really hard to break down someone's thesis. If you wouldn't be able to necessarily break down my investing thesis if you were a day trader and I was along. We'd be looking at two very different things.
Absolutely.
Right. So we need to find people who kind of invest like us, or at least similar, who are willing to really rip apart your thesis and kind of hold you accountable. Why do you think this?
Yeah.
And be honest with you. So whether it's a group or just a partner, that's a big help. And I know we always say Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett do that for each other, and everyone needs that. Yeah. So the second one is stress management. And all that means is that you don't want to be making big investing decisions when you're going through a big life event. Or maybe you're even just having a bad day.
Oh, yeah.
It's not the time to sit down and decide that you're going to sell a position or buy a position.
So that's a really good point, because there's other things other than market stresses that can cause you to make, poor decisions. Maybe something's happened in your life, you've had an issue at work and you're stressed out. That's probably not the best time to be executing trades on your portfolio. Mm-hmm. So I think that's very salient.
Yeah, it's like, people say you shouldn't discuss in marriage, you shouldn't discuss big stressors right before bed, because the chances of that turning into a fight are astronomically higher than if you discuss it in the morning when you're fresh and you're not tired and all of that. So it's the same thing with investing. I mean, we're talking about our retirement. We're talking about money that we've worked hard for. We don't want to make any bad decisions simply because there's an exterior force working on us.
And that's clouding your judgment.
That's clouding our judgment.
Yeah.
So I think we'll end there. If you can like and subscribe this video, that really helps. And we'll see you next week.